Thanks very much, Alan. Well, it's good to see all of you here. Some are familiar faces from last night and from other times. But anyways, welcome. And it's, like I say, it's really great to see you all here. I've known Judy for several years. Judy came to Canada when she was a child and grew up in a small town in Ontario. And she became a school teacher. And while she was a school teacher, she was also teaching creative writing. And she was a mentor for several students. And the other thing was, I used to hear her every Sunday afternoon on CBC Radio because she was a book reviewer. And I really enjoyed listening to her on Sunday afternoon because her reviews were always top-notch. Now, the other thing that was really funny, my friend Wei Sun Choi lives in Toronto, so one year I visited Wei Sun, and there was a copy of Judy's book called China Dog and Other Short Stories. So I read it through, and I said, hey, this is really good. And I said, who is she? And Wei Sun said, well, I'm her mentor. And I said, oh, really? Gee, I would really love to meet Judy. So sure enough, he did arrange for me to meet Judy. And that time she was living in Toronto. It was somewhere. It was an apartment on a cliff of some sort. It was a strange setup because you can see the apartment on the street level, but the rest of the building went down the gully. And was it your floor number was 1705 or something? Or and I thought 17 floors up. You know, but no, it was down. So it was a very unusual apartment. Anyway, I got to know Judy that way. And I found that she is a wonderful writer. And if you haven't bought a copy of her book, you're in for a real treat. She is a wonderful writer. I've often mentioned to her that, you know, in some ways she's better than Wei Sun, but don't tell Wei Sun. But Judy is a wonderful writer, and she has a wonderful sense of humor. And she did live in Toronto, but she and her husband, Michael, live out on a farm, which I had the privilege of spending several days out there a couple of years ago. And it was really wonderful, all that fresh air. And, well, there was a lot of fresh air out in Campbellford. So it was a lot of fun. But anyway, it's because I know Judy quite well, and I was the one that brought her out here to do some reading because of her newly launched book called Year of Memory. And we had a wonderful session last night at Fu's Ho Ho, and you probably might have heard her being interviewed on the early edition yesterday morning. And as well, she was interviewed on CBC Book Club, which will be broadcast on North by Northwest June the 5th. And also, I think she was interviewed. Oh, yes, that's right too. And the other thing, she's going to Victoria tomorrow, and she was already interviewed on a Victoria radio station. Anyways, with all that introduction, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you, Judy Fong-Bates. So please give her a nice, warm Vancouver welcome.
For a stool. I want to be seen, not just heard. Thank you for this wonderful invitation to speak at UBC. Special thanks to Winnie, to Alan, and of course to my dear friend Larry. I am really impressed that there are so many people here, 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, to come and listen to me speak. I was thinking that so many of you would probably much rather be at home with your feet up and a bottle of beer in your hand. But here you are. What an honor. I am here to talk about my book and to give you some background leading up to the book and to, I guess, partly why I wrote it, why this book is important to me. One of the things that I did want to bring up is that I first came to Vancouver after arriving in Canada in 1955. After I arrived in 1955 with my mother, I didn't really travel anywhere. And the first time I came to Vancouver was in 1970. And when I arrived in 1970 in Vancouver, I was really struck by how different the Chinatown here is from the one in Toronto. First of all, I remember arriving in Chinatown in Vancouver and getting in a cab, and the driver was Chinese. I remember crossing the street and seeing a policeman who was Chinese. And I remember going into a store and, buying, I think, some photographic equipment, some film or something, and I was served by someone who was Chinese. And again, it really struck me as a kid from the East and who was used to a Chinatown where there was a grocery store and where there were restaurants and where the Chinese people were in occupations that were really quite ghettoized, I guess. And suddenly to come here to Vancouver, to a place where the Chinese had actually formed a community that really had quite a lot of breadth and depth. And whenever I've come to Vancouver, I'm always amazed that I meet people who are serious senior citizens and who were born here and who speak English like a Canadian. Whereas most of the Chinese who are older in Toronto, they are first generation and they speak with an accent. And it's a very, very different situation. And so that sometimes makes me wonder that if I had been raised on the West Coast, would I have been a writer? Because if I had been on the West Coast, I would probably have a much greater sense of community. Even if I had been raised in Victoria or Nanaimo, where the communities, where the Chinese communities are smaller, I think I would have had a much stronger sense, perhaps, of who I was. And I would not have had that outsider status. And I sometimes wonder if it is that outsider status that has, in fact, made me a writer. My father came to Canada first in 1914, and when he came in 1914, he was one of the Chinese who paid the head tax. He paid a head tax of $500, which in 1914 was a phenomenal amount of money. And I remember in my research that it's actually enough money, or was enough money then in 1914, to actually buy a house. Probably not a mansion, but a house. And he went back and forth between China and Canada really up until the Second World War. He went back to China on one of those journeys and he married a woman and he started a family. When he returned to Canada just before the start of the Second World War, he was actually stranded here for about the entire length of the war, and then he went back after the war to marry my mother. Because what had happened was that prior to the war, my mother had gone to my father's village and she had become a school teacher. Now, my mother always led me to believe that there was nothing between her and my father, that they had only a professional relationship. But after the war, my mother had a daughter from her first marriage. My father's wife from his first marriage had died. The 3 children were stranded, basically orphaned, and so she said it only made sense that the 2 of them get married. And this is what had happened. And my father, when he went back to China after the Second World War and married my mother, they opened up a store. And I think that they were really just on the cusp of beginning a life together. And I think they were on the cusp of beginning a life, if there was not romance, at least there would have been some kind of satisfaction. Well, what happened, we all know, is that the communists took over China. And my father, I think, right to the very end, had hoped that the Kuomintang would win. And my father was one of the Chinese who had bought all these Kuomintang bonds. And in the prologue in the book, I talk about finding these bonds. He must have spent a small fortune on these bonds, which are now useless. They're very beautiful, but useless. Well, when my mother and I finally arrived in Canada, and of course there was very little choice because she realized that in order for me to have any kind of a future, we would have to come to Canada. My parents, as I knew them, were very bitter people. They quarreled a lot. My mother was very sharp-tongued. We lived in two small towns. My father, prior to my mother arriving, had lived in a number of other small towns throughout Ontario. But my parents were two of the most unhappy people, I think, that I have ever met. And I think a lot of this had to do with the fact that they were outsiders. They had no sense of community. When my mother and I arrived in Acton, Ontario, I was the only Chinese child in the town, and my mother was the only Chinese woman. Back then, there were no resources to help people integrate. There were no resources to help people learn the language. And I think that for a woman, the loss of sisterhood is particularly devastating. The saving grace, of course, in all this was that even though I was a child and living in this supposedly very unhappy situation, I think by hook or by crook or by sheer force of will, I had a happy childhood. And I think that was because I lived two worlds. There was the world at home, and there was the world outside of my house, the world where I had friends, where I went to brownies, where I joined explorers, where I rode my bike, where I was teacher's pet. Now, I remember as I grew up in this small town, what was, and again, this was not something that I realized as I grew up, but the message to me, or my cultural references in that small town, were all white. My teacher was white, the doctor was white, the fireman was white, the pharmacist was white. Every book I read was written by a white person. When I watched TV, the people there were all white. And I think on a subliminal level, I must have wanted to see myself reflected in some way in the cultural life around me. I wanted to see myself reflected in the cultural life around me, in spite of the fact, and I truly remember this, that as a young child, I wanted to grow up and look like Sandra Dee. Remember Sandra Dee? She had blonde hair and blue eyes and those beautiful round cheeks. Well, she was my idea of beauty, and if I had had any wish, I would have grown up to look like Sandra Dee. Well, thank God I didn't grow up and look like Sandra Dee, because she ended up being rather difficult, shall we say. Anyway, I remember my mother taking me to Toronto, and we would go to the Chinese movies, and we would see Chinese people in the movies. But in my child's mind, that never counted, because those people were speaking Chinese. And I wanted someone who was Chinese who would speak English. And I remember that the only people I saw on a regular basis who were Chinese on TV and who spoke English were Hop Sing in Bonanza. Remember Bonanza? And I also remember there was Peter in Bachelor Father. Well, neither of those people really did it for me, because I remember Peter being not, you know, kind of a bit simple. And I remember thinking that he really wasn't very cool. And he really just wasn't someone that I wanted to model myself after. And just to give you a sense of how utterly desperate I was to find myself reflected, I remember once going through the TV guide, and actually I did this on quite a regular basis. I would go through the TV guide and I would look for programs that might have some kind of Chinese connection. And I remember one day going through the TV guide and finding out that there was going to be an episode of Wagon Train. Do you remember Wagon Train? Anybody here remember watching Wagon Train? And it was a program where the wagon train went across the Midwest. That show must have been on for about 5 years, I'll bet, and they never made it to California. They were always going through the Midwest. They were constantly in this wagon train going through the Midwest. Well, I remember in one particular episode, there was going to be a Chinese princess on the wagon train. Well, heaven knows what a Chinese princess was going to be doing on a wagon train. Who knows? But it ended up that this Chinese princess fell in love with one of the cowhands. And I remember circling that program, and my face must have been this close to the screen. I didn't care that the program was not believable. And I didn't care that the Chinese princess was played by Carol Lawrence. Remember Carol Lawrence? Carol Lawrence was Maria in the original production of Broadway. Beautiful Carol Lawrence, who was married to the Canadian icon Robert Goulet. Well, she played the beautiful Chinese princess, and I didn't care that they taped her eyes back so that she would look vaguely Chinese. I watched it anyway. I think it's just to give you an idea that for a kid like me, I didn't care that a crumb was tossed on the floor. I wasn't too proud to pick it up. So you can imagine how phenomenally excited I must have been when The World of Susie Wong came out on the screen. And it didn't matter to me that the Roxy Theatre in Acton had closed at that point, and I was probably too young to watch a movie like The World of Susie Wong, and actually I did see it later in life, and I have to admit that it was one of the worst movies I've ever seen. Robert Holden is not in any way believable as an artist. He dresses like a banker. Forget it. But nevertheless, I remember being very, very proud that Nancy Kwan was in a movie where English was spoken, and I remember buying every single movie magazine where she was featured. And I remember that there was this one byline about Nancy Kwan, and I don't know why I remembered it, and it said, "Her walk is even sexier than Marilyn Monroe's." So there you go. Those are the things that you remember when you're a Chinese kid growing up in a white small town and you're looking for cultural references. Well, I often think that that's one of the reasons why it took me so long to write, was because I think my subliminal message was the books that you read, the important books, are written by people who are white. Why would you, a Chinese girl, have a story to tell that might be of importance or that might want to be read by people of the larger community? Why would someone white want to read your story? Something else happened to me when I was about 15 or 16. And just by sheer coincidence, there is someone in the audience whom I have not seen since I was in high school. And I believe that it was this young teenager then, who is now a man of my age, actually, I remember, gave me a copy. I don't know if it was given to me, but told me that I should read James Baldwin. And I remember taking this copy of Another Country and reading it from one cover to the other. And then I found Giovanni's Room, and I too read that from one cover to the other. And what I remember about both those books was that I didn't know what they were about, because I was a teenager who was romantically totally uninitiated. I didn't know anything about heterosexual love, much less homosexual love. So what on earth was I reading about gays living in Paris and New York for? When I think back on those books, I don't think I even understood the word "the" or the word "and." I didn't understand their connection in those books. And yet I read them cover to cover. And the only reason I can think of that I must have read them besides James Baldwin's language, was because that man was black. And I think, again, the message there must have been, I am black. I write books. People buy my books. And so maybe I thought that maybe one day even I too might write a book that people might want to read and people might want to buy. Well, I was about 16 or 17 when I read James Baldwin, and I must confess that I haven't read him again. But nevertheless, he has, I think, had an influence on my life. But still, it took me almost another 30 years before I published my first book. I was 47 years old. And I think that it just simply took that long for that confidence to gain and to build. Now, the next question that comes to my mind is, if I wrote that first book at age 47, why did it take me so long to write this book about my family? Because, in fact, when I was a teenager, I actually said to a friend that I'm going to write a book one day. And I said to her, I'm going to write a book about my mother. Now, my mother had lived a very dramatic life until she came to Canada. She was born to a herbalist father. Her father had betrothed her at age 3. She was married at age 16. She ended up marrying a man who turned out to be an opium addict. He was a gambler, and he also severely mistreated her. And that's why she left the marriage. She actually left the marriage. And you can imagine, this would have been in about 1930. She actually left that marriage and went to my father's village and taught school. And when you think of those times, it took considerable gumption. And she was only in my father's village for a few years before she went to school in the city of Nanjing. And her brother, who was a high-ranking official in the Kuomintang army, actually sent her to Nanjing to go to school, and she would study about, and she would study silkworms, and then she would open up a business and she would be independent. Well, again, history was not on her side. She, again, this is according to my mother, she left the city of Nanjing on the last train to Shanghai, and she took the last boat out of Shanghai, and she just missed the massacre of Shanghai. She managed to make it back to Canton, and she continued to live with her brother for another while, and then the Japanese invasion moved further south into Canton, and I think that at that point it became kind of a free-for-all and a every man, woman for himself sort of situation, and that's when she ended up returning to her first husband, and she ended up giving birth to my half-sister. And so there I've got all the elements of this incredibly dramatic story and set against the backdrop of a war. So I guess the question is, why did it take me so long, again, to write this book about my family? And I think the explanation is that when I was 22, my father committed suicide. Now, suicide is an act that has stigma, I think, within any culture. But I think the stigma within a Chinese culture is particularly severe. And I think that's because in Chinese culture, the most important thing is face. You must maintain face under all odds. Face is far more important than transparency. But what happened was that in 2006, I went back to China. And at that point, I hadn't been to China since I arrived in 1955. It had been over 50 years. And I ended up going back with my 2 half-brothers, who are in fact old enough to be a parent. And I went back with my husband, and our entourage grew and grew, and I think we were about a party of 13 by the time we got on the plane. And when I went back to China, I finally met my half-sister, whom I hadn't seen since I was 3 years old. And I met all these people who knew all about me, all about my life. They knew whom I was married to. My mother had sent back pictures and I went into our family home, our ancestral home, and I saw pictures of me and my children and my husband. I saw pictures of my brothers and my sister and their wedding and their children. And so they had already had a sense of our life over here, or at least a sense of the life that my mother wanted to present to them. But what was interesting was that I knew nothing about them, because I think I was so busy being a Canadian that I really didn't give them much thought at all. And when I went back, one of my relatives and my sister also said something to me that I dismissed. I didn't think that it could be true. And what she said to me was that your mother, and this is what was interesting, the way my sister put it. She said, your mother chased my father, as if our father belonged to her, but not to me. And so it was my mother who had chased her father. And I thought, this couldn't be. She's making something up. And I heard all these things about my parents that sounded like bits of mythology. And rather than being curious or even being complimented and thinking that they had these wonderful thoughts about my parents, I was annoyed. I was annoyed to the point of being almost angry, because I felt that I was the one who really knew my parents, that I was the one who held the truth. And I really wanted to set the record straight. Well, I couldn't. And I came back to Canada, and I started really thinking about this. And as hard as I tried, I couldn't dismiss it. So what happened was, a year later, my husband and I went back. And we went back, and we ended up staying a month in my ancestral village. And I talked to a lot of different people, including my nieces and my sister and neighbors whom my father had sent money back to. And I didn't uncover one piece of information. It seemed that I would uncover one piece, and then another piece, and another piece. And the story that started to emerge was a story that the more I thought about it, it truly broke my heart, because I discovered two people who were on the cusp of happiness and who had been thoroughly betrayed by history. And so when I came back to Canada, I suddenly had the lens of these two journeys, and it was through those two journeys that I was finally able to tell my parents' story. And with that, I will read you just a very small section. And what I discovered, too, was that I had a story not just about immigration, but really it's a story about finding place. And I hope that it's a story that just doesn't speak to immigrants, but is, in fact, a story that will speak to our collective humanity. And because it's a Friday night, I am going to read you a section that I think might be a little bit amusing, because this is a book that goes back and forth, and it also talks about the period where my mother was living with us. And for any of you who are looking after aging parents, you know how difficult it is, and with some of those difficulties, there's nothing more valuable than a sense of humor. But before I start, I'm going to have a sip of water. At this point, my mother had just moved in with my family. We were living in High Park in Toronto, and I was still teaching. I arrived home from work, and the moment I closed the front door, my mother called from the second floor, telling me to come quick. She'd been living with us for just over a year. I rushed up the stairs and found her sitting on the edge of her bed, wringing her hands in her lap, her forehead creased with worry lines. I knew she'd been watching the clock for my return. At moments like these, I felt heartsick about the days she spent alone in my house. My mother patted the spot beside her, indicating that I should sit down. She pursed her lips together in a way that told me she was about to announce something important. She straightened her back and took a deep breath. Whatever she was about to impart had occupied her mind for a long time, and however minor it might seem to me, this concern would have mushroomed into something monumental. We were the only people in the house, but she still held her hand to the side of her mouth and whispered that I had to get rid of the cleaning lady. She said the cleaning lady was a thief and had stolen her underwear. I was shocked, but I also had difficulty suppressing a smile. My cleaning lady weighed at least twice as much as my mother and stood at least a head taller. At best, she would have been able to fit one leg into my mother's underpants, and even if she had wanted to steal them. When I stood up and opened her drawer and showed her the missing items, my mother quickly retorted that the cleaning lady had put them back because she knew I was coming home. No matter how much I argued, I could not persuade her that the cleaning lady was not a thief. You are too trusting. Your life has been too easy, but I know how a devious mind works, my mother insisted. Can't you see? The cleaning lady doesn't want them for herself. She wants to sell them. Now it was really hard not to laugh. When my mother saw that I was unconvinced, she accused me of siding with the cleaning lady against her. I was ready to point out that her underwear was full of holes, that the cleaning lady would be more likely to use them for rags, when I thought better of it and decided to try another tactic. I said that if the cleaning lady wanted to steal her belongings, she would have taken the new pairs, the ones that I had bought years ago, still unused and wrapped in tissue paper, the ones being saved for good. Do you think I'm stupid? Of course I know that's what she really wanted. My mother clucked her tongue and shook her head in exasperation, much in the way that an adult would at an uncomprehending child. She could have made lots of money if she stole my brand new things, but I saw through her and put them where she can't find them. That's why she took the ones I wear every day. But she's so sneaky, she put them back just before you came home. Finally, I gave up and told her that it was a good thing that the undergarments were returned. I said not to worry because even if all her clothing was missing, I had so much money, I'd be able to buy her everything she needed. My mother gave a sigh of relief. Good thing you make so much money, she said. I'm so glad you have such a good job. She hesitated for a moment. Then her tone became stern. Don't ever quit your job. Lots of people want a good job like yours and would steal it if you left. There was that word again. Nevertheless, I was quite pleased with myself for stumbling onto this clever diversion. Then she suddenly perked up. She thrust her head forward, about to begin a mission. Have you paid off your mortgage yet? She demanded, wagging a finger. That's what's most important. Forget nice clothes and holidays. That's what's most important. That and good food, paying off your mortgage. Chinese people don't like owing money and paying interest. Not like loafons like Westerners. Charge you this, charge you that. It served me right bragging about imaginary wealth, even if it was just to put her at ease. When I tried to change the topic of conversation again, she became stubborn and fixated on whether I still had a mortgage. Finally, I capitulated and told her what she wanted to hear. I mumbled under my breath and said that we'd paid off our house. A broad, satisfied grin broke across her face. Thank God. Now I can die without worry. And thank goodness you married a good loafon. I suppose every group has good and bad. You could have just as easily married a bad Chinese, someone who smokes and gambles. You're lucky. Michael looks after his family, and he knows how to fix everything, saves a lot of money. And he's not like some people, charge you this, charge you that. All concerns about the cleaning lady had vanished, at least for now. I was happy to end our conversation with the topic of thrift and my marvelous husband. Michael chuckled whenever he heard reports of my mother's boasting. She had been reluctant to accept him when we first met. While we were still an unmarried couple, She continued to tell me about good Chinese boys who were looking for a wife, with whom matchmaker Auntie would be more than happy to organize a meeting. I never took my mother's suggestions seriously. She grew frustrated with my dismissive attitude, and as a final resort, she told me that it wouldn't hurt to meet one of these boys. It wasn't as if it was going to cost anything. Matchmaking services were always paid for by the groom, she pointed out. But now she couldn't stop extolling Michael's virtues to the point of fabrication. She had decided in her own mind that her son-in-law was a saver, someone who used only cash. Credit cards, as far as she was concerned, were for less worthy and less responsible low-fawns. Chinese people never touched them, according to my mother. A few days after the cleaning lady incident, she went for a walk after supper and became lost. Michael hopped on his bicycle and searched our neighborhood. Once he found her, he raced home and got in the car. It was a warm, sunny evening, so I was not concerned with her falling or catching a chill. We both knew that she walked so slowly that she would not be far from where he had originally found her. When she arrived home, she was unaware that she had gone for a walk and thought her kind son-in-law had taken her for a summer evening's drive. Another night, not long after my family was seated around the kitchen table, I'd made spaghetti with meat sauce for dinner that night, one of my mother's favorite meals, since after Chinese, Italian was her preferred cuisine. Right up until her death, she continued to love food and maintained a good appetite. We had almost finished eating when my mother asked me if I'd ever been to Miami. I shook my head, and she informed me that she had been many times. I stared at her, my fork held in midair. While she was living with Dune, my brother, she and a girlfriend had taken a bus tour of Los Angeles and San Francisco. Once she'd even been to New York to stay with Ming Ni, my sister. But other than these two trips, she had traveled very little since leaving China, and she had certainly never even been close to Florida. My mother ignored my reaction and said that it was very easy to get to beautiful Miami. Dumbfounded, I asked her, "How?" "There's a bridge from Hong Kong to Miami," my mother said. "You can walk across it, very easy." I almost choked on my pasta. I put down my fork, barely able to keep a straight face, and said, "That's not possible. There's no bridge connecting the two cities." My mother turned her head in my direction, her eyes steady with confidence. "You don't know everything. I'm the one who should know. I walked across that bridge." I let the conversation drop, and my mother requested a second helping. I asked one of my daughters to get up and replenish her grandmother's plate. Every night, our dinner table had two simultaneous conversations, one in Chinese between me and my mother, and one in English for everyone else. There were times when I was expected to participate in both simultaneously, and I often lost track. But that night, Michael and our daughters had stopped talking, suddenly drawn into an exchange they could not comprehend. My husband asked, "What's your mother so worked up about?" When I told my family, they smiled, but Michael's eyes looked worried. My daughter set the refilled plate in front of her grandmother and started to cut the pasta into shorter lengths. Before sitting down, she gave her grandmother a quick hug. As I watched my mother and my daughter, I could no longer deny that my mother's mind had become like a boat without moorings. The moment a conversation was finished, we could begin the same one again, and for her, it was as if nothing had been said. I remember noticing that she could read the same article in a newspaper several times, repeatedly, without seeming to realize it. My amusement vanished, and I suddenly felt short of breath. The day before, I had returned home and found a tap left running. Tomorrow, it might be a pot left boiling on the stove. And I'll stop there. Okay. I'm supposed to have a Q&A? do we have time?
Start with Q&A, and then so that you can have a little break. Right?
Okay.
And if you want to read more, we can continue doing that.
Well, I have noticed that people like Q&As, and so if there are any questions, I would be happy to try and answer them. If not, we can have a break. Any brave souls?
Any questions? Yes, the gentleman there.
Oh yeah, just wondering, was it the beginning of Alzheimer's or something?
Yes, it was, or senile dementia. I believe so, but I'm not a medical doctor. Yes, sir.
How did you communicate with the village people in terms of exchanges?
I speak Chinese.
I realize that, but your Chinese communication is really limited. Is that right?
I'm sorry?
Your Chinese capabilities are limited?
No, they're not limited.
I mean, in terms of writing and...
I don't read and I don't write, but I speak fluent Toisanese,
Yeah.
which is the dialect of the four counties. And I was actually very surprised when I returned to the four counties that how much that dialect is in fact the working dialect, and I was quite at ease bargaining with the taxi drivers and the people in the hotels and so forth, so it was actually very easy. Yes, sir.
Yeah, is it a challenge to remember all these like things in your book, memories,
Was it a challenge? I found that as I wrote, more memories would evolve, and also as I wrote, memories would crystallize, that they would clarify, that would happen as well. And of course, this is not a book just of my memories. I think that's why I came up with the title of Finding Memory. It was finding other people's memories and incorporating them into a story. Yes. I'm sorry?
Were there any people who would have like preferred their story not to be told, or preferred it to be kind of masked or something like that? Or did you more or less have kind of permission to tell it as it is?
Excuse me. Can I check? Can people hear at the back?
No.
No. Do you want to repeat?
Yes. The question, I probably won't have your wording exact, so you'll have to help me out. The question, I believe what you want to ask is that were there any people who objected to my writing this story? Is that basically it in a nutshell?
It's based on like like real people. I thought, was there anybody who wanted you to kind of gloss over a certain event or beautify it a little bit more? Was it comfortable to write the whole story as you felt?
This story, or this book, is a memoir. So it is told from my point of view. It is a subjective story. I must confess that I didn't ask other people whether they wanted me to write it or not. I think the questions that I have to ask myself as a writer and as an artist is, do I have a story? What I don't want a link of facts. I don't want a link of events. I want a story that's going to build, that's going to have tension, that's going to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And regardless of whether I'm writing fiction or whether I'm writing memoir, the story elements are really far, far more important than anything else. But because it's a memoir, I also have faith that my version is only my version. It's not everyone's version. I find it fascinating that you can have two siblings experience the exact same event, and one will tell it as a joyous event, and the other one will tell it as a harrowing event, perhaps even. That one can put a humorous spin on it, and the other one feels damaged by the same event. And so, because I'm not writing a biography about Stephen Harper, where I would have to get all my facts straight, this is my story. And so your story of the same event might be very different and just as valid. Does that answer your question to a degree? Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Did your mother ever get a chance to go back to China?
My mother never did go back to China. I think it's one of those unfortunate truths that it breaks my heart when I think about it.
Would she have liked it, do you think?
I would like to think that she would have liked it, but my mother had been through so much deprivation, and for the time that we lived in Canada, we were a poor family, and my mother really didn't begin to feel any sense of financial security until her children were adults and were well established themselves. That's when she began to feel financially secure. And I think that with her, as I read in this passage, that the whole notion of spending money on something as frivolous as a trip back to China would have just been beyond her ken. I'm not sure that she would have been able to do it. Yes?
Also, when you were in China visiting our families there, and were you like having some culture shock?
Did I have any culture shock?
Here for so long, and were you struggling and have to kind of overcome the struggling and just come back with a peaceful mind? If you did have a struggle or something.
Did I have culture shock in China? I heard that.
Were you struggling a bit?
Struggling.
Was I struggling in China or here?
Oh, in China.
In China. Certainly there was culture shock for me in China because I live in Canada. It's a developed world, you know. We flush toilets are the norm. So when I went to China, even though I had been to other third world countries before, I think that there's always a certain degree of culture shock, but that's the beauty of traveling, isn't it? I wouldn't say it was a struggle because I think that as a traveler, I like to think of myself as flexible, and I like to think of myself as accepting, and I also like to think that I'm quite willing to put up with what I call fumble time. You know, that if things don't go right, well, you know, you try again later.
Did you also ask where in China? Did you ask?
Yes.
You were talking about your happy childhood and however you're quite poor. When you went back and found out how many people were benefactors of your parents' wealth,
Yes.
how did that make you feel?
Oh, it was heartbreaking because my parents were very, very poor, and any kind of money that they were able to send back, it was through total deprivation. They saved through depriving themselves. And, you know, I never felt deprived as a child, in spite of the fact that I grew up in a home that, you know, we didn't have a television, we didn't have a car, we didn't have a, you know, I mean, we're all these things. But I think that I was quite willing to live in two worlds. Now, I don't want to give the notion that I didn't suffer from certain things like racism and all those things, but I think that I was a kid with a pretty buoyant spirit, and I was able to deal with that. And the other thing that was really instrumental, I think, in giving me that buoyant spirit was that even as a child, and even though my parents were unhappy and they were bitter, the thing that was always clear to me was that they loved me intensely. And I think that that's something that just, it carries you through life. And in fact, it's something that you feed on till the day you die. Yes.
Could you see yourself living in the village after in Canada?
Could I see myself living in the village?
Yes.
Knowing what I know now? No. In a word, no.
They said, wow.
I mean, could I see myself living without electricity and hauling water from the river? And no. I mean, camping is fun for a week or two, but as a endless, you know, for perpetuity, no.
What do you say to the villagers
What
do you say to the villagers that you met when you went back to their village? How do you communicate that to inspire them because you're from Canada you try to get their story. How does that make you feel?
I spent a lot of time talking to them. I think the fact that I gave everybody money helped. I mean, it is expected. I mean, there is a section in the book on the first time that we went back. One of my brothers took a wad of bills with him of 50 yuan, and he must have had a wad about that thick. And he was just handing them out. And people actually formed a line, and they lined up, and he was handing out a bill to each person who came up to him in line. And when I went back on the second visit, one of my relatives told me there were people who lined up more than once. So but again, that kind of generosity, I think, is expected. And my feeling is so it should be, because we are the lucky ones. We are the lucky ones. Yes.
Judy, I was wondering, from the time you met your relatives to the finished product of your book, your construction of the memory of these relatives, how have they changed? Like your journey of these people, like creating these stories, these people, like your relationship with them from the beginning when you first met them to the end after you wrote the story. Did you find yourself having to change attitudes or perceptions?
Well, certainly in the first journey, they felt like strangers, even though we were related by blood. And certainly by the end of the second journey, they felt more like my relatives, and they felt more like my friends. But on the other hand, they didn't totally feel like peers, because what I realized is that we had relatives in common, but we didn't have experiences in common. And so in some ways, we didn't share reference points. And so that perhaps made it harder to have immediate intimacy. And I think that if intimacy were to develop between me and my relatives in China, it might take longer. I think it would take longer to achieve. But I think that's just the difference of living in two different worlds. For instance, some of my relatives, the ones my age, had been through the Cultural Revolution, and they had been through experiences that I really couldn't identify with in any way whatsoever. But on the other hand, I had been through wearing miniskirts and living and listening to the Beatles and all those kinds of things, and they probably couldn't in any way imagine how lucky my life has been. What do you mean? Is that because I'm female?
Because you really don't belong to the village, per se, in Chinese culture, right? You left the village, you are quote outcast in the village because your brothers belong to the village. Okay? Although you have a connection because of your surname, there is the female and male equivalent.
It might have. I don't know, but it may have something to do with it, but I guess from my point of view, and again, I can only speak from my point of view about the sense of intimacy having to be developed over time. From their point of view, it might be because I was a girl married out of the village. Yes?
You were saying that your parents were unhappy and they were bitter. Now, what were they bitter about? Were they bitter about they had to leave China, do you think? Because, like your mom, was she bitter about having to leave and going to a place where she didn't know anybody?
I think all of that. I think I'd be pretty bitter if I had to wash clothes for a living and nobody spoke my language and I was the only You know, I think I somehow, I can't see myself being a happy camper, you know, in that situation.
Or they were just bitter, like, against each other, or like you said, they were unhappy, but, you know, was it because of each other or because of their life, or
I think
why?
all of that. I think all of that. That I think that whatever possibilities of happiness had probably vanished, and I think that there was a lot of blame there. I think there was, I think that there was a lot of feeling on my mother's part that she had married down, all those sorts of things. You'll have to read the book. Yes. David?
You talked about growing up living in two worlds, and I'm wondering if you still feel that way. And in fact, you know, after your parents' death, after your mother's death, certainly, did you feel that you moved more into one world, the one that of your marriage and your...
Well, yes, certainly I am. As a writer and as an artist, I really do feel that I am Chinese Canadian. But as a citizen, I'm 100% Canadian. And I think that I negotiate pretty well in the mainstream world. But nevertheless, I think because of my background and because of the fact that I have lived in two worlds and negotiated two worlds, I think that gives me an outsider status. And I think that the outsider status, that notion of being in between, that's the place from which I write. I write from the in-between. I don't write from the inside track. Yes, sir. That I was in a better place? You know, I think that search for place, and I have to, you know, confess that I think I'm generally in a pretty good headspace. But there are always things that happen to you that I think make that search for place a lifelong quest, in fact. That's my, you know, sort of pop philosophy, I guess. Yes. Yes.
Yes, in the beginning, thank you very much for the very interesting reading and talk. And in the beginning about your Canadian, Chinese-Canadian identity and cultural references, and the time when you came to visit Vancouver in 1970s, and how the presence of community was quite different from Toronto, your experience. So I just wonder, hypothetically, if you had a choice to choose Toronto or Vancouver, and whether you will be a reader, whether because you'll be always in your spaces in between. So I just wonder that because,
certainly there was a very vibrant community, Chinese community in Toronto, but it just never seemed to have the depth that the community in Vancouver has even now. And I think that the community in Vancouver has really deep roots. But for instance, I was at a dinner last night and I met a young fellow there who said that he was fifth generation Chinese. I mean, that's phenomenal. I don't think there are any fifth generation Chinese in Toronto. And yet in Toronto there are a lot of Chinese. And so it has a lot of breadth, but it doesn't have this, it doesn't have that core that has the same, you know, very long roots. But as far as choosing a community is concerned, oh, I don't know. What would I choose? Would I choose Lake Ontario? Would I choose the mountains? Would I choose the rhododendrons? You know, that's a really hard question, because I must confess that whenever I come to Vancouver, and I am speaking to a Vancouver audience, and it seems that I often come in May, it has got to be the most gorgeous city in the entire world. Because, I mean, you've got mountains on one side, you've got the water on the other side, you've got laburnum, you've got rhododendrons, you have cedar hedges that are thicker than anywhere else on the face of the planet. I mean, it's absolutely stunningly gorgeous. So, I don't really know, but I think that, you know, geez, you know, you really trapped me there. But I really think that so much of it depends upon where your family is, doesn't it? You know, and so that's where the heart is, isn't it? Yeah. Yes.
My last question is, how did you get your confidence to become a writer?
How did I get my confidence? Ooh, you know.
But I never have gotten
Confidence. You know, I remember quite recently, I did a talk with another writer who has also written a memoir, and some of you may have read her work. Her name is Catherine Giltner, and she wrote a book called After the Falls. And we were on stage together doing a Q&A, and I happened to mention the word humble. And she said, "I'm not humble." And I was there, so, you know, being very earnest, and she was saying, "Well, I'm not humble." And I did have to agree with her from the point of view that if you are going to write, you have to have a certain amount of ego. And that ego does have to develop at some point. I mean, believe me, you cannot write if you have no ego. Because, now, that doesn't mean that you're going to be arrogant and horrible. But writing in itself is a leap of faith. You know, I mean, there is that belief that you have something to tell, something to write, and that you believe that it's important enough, I guess I should say, to write and publish. Because, as I say to my writing students, everyone should write, but not everyone should be published. Now, but you know, but you do. You have to have a certain amount of ego, and how that confidence develops, I guess it's through writing again and again and again, through eventually getting published, through getting something small published in a small journal, then, you know, writing something more, and the confidence builds that way. But it's a hard life. Yes.
Writers groups, you know, getting together with people.
I think they're great.
Yeah.
I think they're great. I started out in a writers group, but again, they can have their pitfalls too, because you can belong to a writers group and there can be terrible jealousies that will develop too, because one writer might get published, nobody else gets published. What do you know, it can create terrible jealousies, and I've seen that happen too.
Writing the hard work.
Why is writing hard work? Maybe it's just hard for me. Maybe other writers find it easy. Maybe other writers publish with their first draft. I'm one of those people, I don't know how many drafts I go through. I can't count that high. And my first drafts are so badly written, I'd be terribly embarrassed if anybody ever unearthed one. So maybe I should just speak for myself that I find it hard. Maybe Wei Sin Choi finds it easy, although I hear he goes through at least 20 drafts. Do I enjoy it? You know, writing is one of those situations where it's not something that I do for pleasure, like hiking. Writing is something that I do. That's what I do. I write because that's what I do. There are people who sing. That's what they do. It's as simple as that. I don't have another explanation beyond that.
Any more questions? Yes.
Yeah, Judy, thank you so much for your presentation. You're a real inspiration, not only in writing, but your presentation. It's really amazing. I was wondering whether you thought beyond, after the movie is made and so forth, what are you going to do as a theme for a feature book? You know, are you going to go into some other fictional genre, or, you know, have you given any thought to, like, after this tremendous book?
I'll be writing fiction again. I do think of myself as primarily a fiction writer, and I think one of the reasons this particular memoir appealed to me is because of my fiction roots and my belief in that, in a story. Because I don't think I could have written a piece of fiction that was just, you know, a linking of facts and events, that to me there had to be emotional drama in it, and I think that's what compelled me to write this particular book. But yeah, I think I am a writer of fiction primarily. Yeah. Yes?
Midnight at the Dragon Cafe, was that all fiction? Or it sounds like some of it might have been.
Well, certainly. I think all writers go into their own heart to find, to deliver that emotional core. And I think that even when a writer talks about betrayal, for instance, that might occur between two characters and an event that that writer has created, they will probably think back upon their own betrayal or loss or sorrow and then impose it into that situation. So it's always, in a sense, coming out of one's own core, even if you invent, you know, situations and characters and whatever. You're always somehow imposing yourself. And I've heard, even with people who write science fiction, that they will write about a landscape that they already know, but they will write about it in such a way that you will think it's another world.
No more questions? Can you read another piece for us?
Well, I could read a short piece. I think you have been such a good audience. You know, I'll read. I will read a very short piece about my mother. Okay. The greatest pleasure of those, this is taking place in Acton when I was a child. The greatest pleasure of those early years in Acton was the Saturday afternoon movie at the Roxy Theatre on Mill Street. I went almost every weekend and sat inside the long auditorium with its curved ceiling, waiting for the lights to go off and for the screen at the front to light up. As the air thickened with the smell of cigarette smoke and buttered popcorn, I laughed at the zany antics of the Three Stooges, did chores on the farm with Ma Pa Kettle, and rode on horses through the Wild West with the Lone Ranger and Tonto. The movies taught me that families could be happy and that it was possible for two people to find contentment together. I learned that when a boy and a girl were in love, they held hands, spoke softly, and kissed gently. In fact, everything I needed to know about romance and true love, I discovered at the Roxy Theatre. I was determined that I would be like the girls on that big screen. One day, I too would fall in love and get married. In my life, there would be no room for a matchmaker. Under no circumstances would I be like my mother, betrothed at age 3 and married at age 16. I would not sit back and let someone else determine my future for me. I would have a boyfriend, go out on dates, and I would laugh with my mouth wide open. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy.
Thank you.
I really want to thank you, Judy, to come all the way from Toronto and give us this chance to meet with you and hear you speak about the writing of the book and also sharing your very, very, how shall I put it, very personal story. And read the book, I love it, and I'm sure that many of us have read it will feel the connection. And you talk about the in-between places, and in the audience today here, many are living in the in-between places, even though some of us may not think of it as the in-between places. So we're going to look at that space in a different way after we read the book. And on behalf of all our partners here, the little souvenir, you want to come on up here? So a couple of people can take a photograph for us. Thank you so much.
Okay, yes.
my own collectible from UBC, 100 years old medal for you, and another thing from the comment.